Hello, I'm Kim.
I'm Jackie.
And I'm Danny, and we are True Crime Rhymes with Vodka. Join us bi-weekly to hear Kim and Jackie telling each other stories of true crime.
While our main focus is to respect victims and bring awareness, we also have some lighthearted, real talk between best friends of 30 years.
If you need something to lift your spirits, besides what Jackie has in her cup, stick around and hear listener-submitted stories of drunken debauchery at the end of each episode.
Find us wherever you listen to podcasts.
Cheers!
Before we begin this week's episode, I'd like to start with a content warning. This podcast includes foul language and includes discussions of violent crimes. Some topics may be triggering and may include depictions of sexual assault, gore, torture, suicidal ideation, or discussions of mental health. Listener discretion is strongly advised. This week, Amanda dives deep into this case about a real estate heir turned murderer, Robert Durst. Not to be confused with the rapper, singer, songwriter, film director, and also frontman of nu metal band Limp Bizkit, who's named William Frederick Durst, or also known as Fred Durst.
That was very unnecessary, but yes, not Fred Durst. Also, yes, I did not even think I'd go so hard on this case, but here we are, and it's quite a doozy. This week we will be digging into this large, wrinkly bag of horse manure and pulling out all the nitty-gritty stuff.
Careful now. But yes, Amanda, you did a fine job researching this case. I'm proud of you. Anyway, I'm Courtney Fenner.
And I'm Amanda Cronin, and a Nefarious Nightmare presents It Was Her or Me, Robert Durst.
Before we dive into this one, I want to start out with our missing persons segment. This one I plan to cover like we did with Tara Calico, but I want to give the opportunity to another podcast who has been researching and really diving into this one, who's also devoted their entire being into bringing attention to it. But I'd like to at least help raise awareness to Prisma Peralta Reyes, who went missing April 17th, 2019. As of the time of this recording, it will have marked 3 years plus a week and a day of the anniversary of her disappearance. Prisma was last seen in downtown Dallas walking to the Olympus at Ross apartment complex at around 6 p.m., and her Jeep was abandoned nearby. She was seen on surveillance video pacing back and forth on her cell phone and making phone calls close by her ex-boyfriend's apartment near the elevator, and surveillance video earlier showed her having lunch with him. Her ex has not been identified, nor has he been named a suspect or even a person of interest. The chilling thing about this is that there was nothing off about the day that she went missing. She was 26 years old at the time of her disappearance, and people were on alert when she didn't show up to pick her son up from the babysitter the day that she went missing. As she is described as someone who vowed to be the best mother she could ever be, so forgetting her son was particularly strange. At the time of her disappearance, she was described as 5'2", 135 pounds, Hispanic with brown eyes and brown hair. She was last seen wearing a red polo-style shirt, cropped jeans, black tennis shoes. Mesquite Police Department are offering a $2,500 reward for information that leads to a resolution in this case. You can call Investigator D. Barrett at 972-285-6336. With this, we bring you the case of Robert Durst.
Robert Allen Durst was born April 12, 1943 in New York City to one of the richest families in New York at the time. He was the eldest child of Seymour Durst, who was the patriarch of a Manhattan office and apartment building empire founded in 1927 by Robert's grandfather, Joseph Durst, an Austrian immigrant, and his mother, Bernice, who, on November 8, 1950, sadly either fell or leaped to her death from the roof of the family's home in Scarsdale.
Now, Robert claimed that he had witnessed the tragic incident. However, later his younger brother Douglas denied that. Robert said that in the documentary The Jinx, that his dad came and got him out of bed in the middle of the night to go, quote-unquote look at mommy as she was standing on the roof of their house. He stated that he waved at her, and then when he was walking back to his bedroom, he heard the maid in the house yell that she's off the roof.
His siblings were Wendy, Douglas, and Thomas. Robert and Douglas, who were both 2 years younger, had many fistfights that Robert initiated, so he was sent to a psychiatrist, and their report mentioned personality decomposition and possibly even schizophrenia when he was 10 years old. You'll hear about him and Douglas a few more times as we go on in this story.
He was a loner in school, and his 1961 yearbook only had one picture of him and mentioned no extracurricular activities.
Robert went on to study economics at Lehigh University, and after graduating in 1965, he attended UCLA, where he became friends with Susan Berman. Susan is one of the victims in this, so we're going to give you the background on her because it is really an interesting one. Her stepkids described her as funny and loving, saying that she laughed a lot even when she was having a hard day.
Now, Susan was born on May 18th, 1945 to parents David and Grace Berman in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Sometime in 1946, her mother brought her to live in Las Vegas, where her father, Davey, was already living so he could further his career as a mobster. Grace, Susan's mother, was a Twin Cities showgirl who adopted the stage name Gladys Evans. Susan said that her father, who was a major crime figure, took over Las Vegas's Flamingo Hotel after Bugsy Siegel's 1947 murder.
Davey died under mysterious circumstances on an operating table when Susan was only 12 years old, but all indications say that he died of a heart attack in 1957 during a colon surgery at the age of 54. Grace died soon after at 34 years old from a drug overdose. Susan always believed that her mother's death was a suicide. Susan later moved to Hollywood, where her classmates included Chadwick School, Jan Winter, and Liza Minnelli.
Interesting. So, Susan, she eventually graduated college with a Bachelor of Arts degree in 1967 and then got her Master of Arts in Journalism in 1969. She was slowly paid a total of $4.3 million by the Mafia for her father's interests in casinos and other properties.
She went on to write 2 autobiographies and a 1971 college guidebook called The Underground Guide to the College of Your Choice. Her first autobiography was called Easy Street, and it detailed her life as a mobster's daughter and even got turned into a screenplay that sold for $350,000. But sadly, no film was ever made.
She would report for the San Francisco Examiner and other various publications, and she was also a contributing writer for magazines such as New York, Cosmopolitan, and Family Circle. She received a Writers Guild of America award for an A&E documentary she co-wrote as well. At the time of her death, she was working on a project for Showtime entitled Sin City. It was planned as Showtime's answer to the show The Sopranos.
She lived just off of the Sunset Strip in Hollywood for several years prior to her final residence in Benedict Canyon, which is a suburb of Los Angeles. There isn't a ton of personal information on her except for her work. She married Christopher, or Mr. Margulies, in 1984. Robert Durst, her dear friend of 20 plus years, even walked her down the aisle. Mr. died of a heroin overdose in 1986. She continued to help raise his kids, though.
So Robert later returned to New York City, and in 1973 he met Kathleen McCormack, a dental hygienist. Kathy McCormack was born in New York and was the youngest of 5 children from her parents, James and Anne. Kathy's father was a World War II veteran and an account representative for the telephone company, while her mother, Anne, stayed home and raised their 5 children.
Very normal childhood, gathered for Sunday dinners, doing chores, going to church and school. Sadly, her father died from cancer when she was 14 years old. Kathy was also a great student, had good grades, member of the National Honor Society, dating the captain of the football team, and she modeled on the side while working part-time.
After graduation, Kathy went on to move out of the suburbs into New York City and got a job as a dental assistant to a dentist in the Plaza Hotel, while sometimes working at Saks Fifth Avenue. One afternoon, she was invited to a party with a friend of hers by a neighbor, and that party was held in the Manhattan apartment of Robert Durst. At the party, she was attracted to him, and their relationship formed quickly.
After only 2 dates, Robert asked her to go with him to Vermont, where he had bought a health food store called All Good Things. She moved to Vermont full-time in 1972 in January and started pretty much running the store for Robert, since he didn't really show up every day and he wasn't dependable. But by the end of that year, Robert got bored with the store and sold it. He says later that his dad pressured him to sell it and go to work for the family business.
He and Kathy spent March of 1973 driving through the South, and when they returned to New York, they agreed to get married after Kathy brought up the idea. They had a very small ceremony on April 12th of 1973, followed by a 6-month-long cross-country trip in a van around America. Camping, they were staying in motels, things like that. Robert then joined the company's realtor business. After getting a nursing degree, Kathy entered Albert Einstein College of Medicine in the Bronx in 1978.
According to many reports, by 1981, their marriage was already unraveling, and there were allegations that he was violent and controlling. Early 1982, Kathy was treated at a Jacobi Hospital in the Bronx for facial injuries. Friends say that she told them the injuries were inflicted by Robert. One time she got pregnant and he forced her to have an abortion. Quoting Robert from the Jinx, he directly told her, quote, "Keep the baby. You're going to be getting the worst from me, period," end quote.
According to the documentary, The Jinx, they also interviewed a friend of Kathy's, Geraldine McInerney, who says that she was one of the last people to see Kathy alive, stating that when Kathy came over to her house in January, she immediately walked into her friend's house and called Bob to tell him that she was there, and he told her to make sure that she was up by 8 a.m. to come back so they could go to their lake house.
Kathy told her friend that she really didn't want to go, which her friend responded with, quote, "Well, tell him you can't go," end quote. And she said Kathy looked horrified and said, quote, "If I did that, he'd kill me," end quote. She told one of her friends that, "Promise me if something ever happens, you'll check it out. I'm afraid of Bobby."
On January 31st, 1982, Kathy disappeared only months before graduating medical school. According to Robert, who did not report her missing until February 5th, which is an entire week pretty much, said that he had taken Kathy to the train station in Katona, New York, so she could return to the city after spending the weekend at their lake house in South Salem.
He admits they got into a really big, quote-unquote, pushing and shoving fight before he drove her to the train station. But friends said that she was supposed to meet with them in the city, and she never made it, and never showed up to class. Her friends were amazing, by the way. They searched for her harder than anyone did. Now, the only person who said they saw her was the doorman. He said he saw her go to their apartment.
Then, someone got a call from someone claiming to be Kathy, saying that she was too sick to come to class. They didn't know if it was actually her or not. Many actually speculated that it was Susan Berman calling for Robert. After that, nothing. Robert said he had no involvement in her disappearance, and though his account of events raised questions.
Robert told police that after he dropped her off at the train station, he came back to the lake house and had a drink with the neighbor, which later the neighbor denied. He even told them that he had very little issues in their marriage, which a lot of people said were not true. Something else suspicious was that there were 2 collect calls made to Seymour Durst's office from a laundromat in New Jersey, which the police know for a fact that Robert was in New Jersey for a couple of days after her disappearance.
When asked why he called collect, he states that he just did that all the time so that his dad would pay for the phone call and he didn't have to. A list that we will talk about more a little later was found in the trash can at the lake house. That list had the following words on them: tow, dump, bridge, dig, boat, other, and under other was shovel ore and check car/truck rent.
During the media attention, Berman served as Robert's unofficial spokesperson, and without leads or a body, the case eventually went cold. And in 1990, Robert obtained a divorce after claiming spousal abandonment. Kathy's family didn't even know that he was going to do this, and honestly, they were really upset.
Robert left the family business after his younger brother, Douglas, was put in charge of Durst organization. I bet that pissed him off. So Douglas has said that Robert really didn't do much for the company and that Robert had threatened to kill him numerous times. He even had bodyguards only to protect him from Robert.
During the Jinx, you see Robert telling the film crew to film him and take his picture in front of Douglas's house. Then he sat there and stared at the house for a while. It was all very strange, even to the film crew.
So for the rest of the 90s, he lived in various states, and in 2000, he remarried to Deborah Lee Chariton. Deborah and Robert only lived together for a few months. Kathleen's case was revived in October 2000, and Robert found out about it. After that is when he proposed to Deborah and gave her power of attorney over his finances and business affairs. They married in a skyscraper in Times Square, New York in December 2000.
Robert later said in a deposition that, quote, "I wanted Debbie to be able to get my fortune, and I intended to kill myself," end quote. Deborah responded to that in the New York Times by stating, quote, "It was our understanding that unless I was married to him, I couldn't profit from any of the trusts," end quote. Robert also stated to his sister while he was in prison that, quote, "I had to have Deborah write my checks. I was preparing to become a fugitive," end quote.
Now, Deborah visited Robert while he was in prison, but she had not spoken to him since he participated in the Jinx, that documentary we keep talking about. Even though she was still technically married to Robert, she had been living with one of Robert's lawyers. They actually remained married until his passing.
Are you wondering how Kathy's case got reopened? Well, Timothy Martin, who was getting sentenced for public lewdness, or aka flashing his business to unwilling eyes, had nothing connected to do with the Durst family. But he told the detective who arrested him that he knew that Kathleen Durst's husband murdered her. A newspaper later wrote, "The snitch told cops Kathleen was killed in Westchester." So this led the police to reopen Kathy's case, which honestly was great news to all her family and friends.
The police went to the lake house that Robert had long ago sold. They asked the new owner if they could search the house for any old bloodstains, ripping up the carpet, took down a wall. They even searched the lake for days. Sadly, nothing of real evidence was found. In 1982, the police never searched or even looked at that house.
In November of 2000, when Robert heard that Kathy's case was being reopened, he moved to Galveston, Texas, where he disguised himself as a mute woman by the name of Dorothy Siner, which, by the way, was a high school girlfriend of his that he had not seen in decades. And he then rented a cheap little apartment there. Just for reference, Galveston Island is what's called a barrier island, which borders at the Texas Gulf Coast and is located about 50 miles southeast of Houston. Right here, we are going to take a quick break.
Lauren DeMolo vanished without a trace on June 19th.
Police called DeMolo's disappearance suspicious.
Lauren DeMolo was last seen more than a week ago at her Cape Coral apartment, and police believe she's in danger.
Where is Lauren DeMolo?
You don't really hear these stories in such a beautiful town. You feel like your whole world is safe.
This is a story that needs to be told, because this story needs an ending.
Her message said, "I don't know what to do. I need to get out of this situation. I need help."
Maybe somebody really was after her.
And I said, "The girl you're supposedly in love with and engaged to has not been home and is missing. And you're not going to be there or go looking for her." I said, "I got a big problem with all of this."
Unexpected twists and turns fuel a community-wide search to bring Lauren home. But Lauren is still missing, and nobody's talking.
I do believe she will be found. I really do believe that justice will be served. A lot of people know exactly what happened.
There are so many puzzle pieces here that you can't figure out what happened.
Someone is responsible. Someone is complicit.
I'm not going to stop until I find out what happened to my daughter.
I'm Hillary Wadsworth. And I'm Caitlin Body. Join us as we seek to find out what really happened to Lauren DeMolo. Complicit is now available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
All right, we're back. So, a month after he moved to Galveston, he took a flight to visit Northern California and headed to Trinidad, where he had a home and office. According to Susan Berman, he was supposed to visit her around the holidays. The following day, on December 20th, he used a calling card to make 2 phone calls from a payphone in Garberville, California.
Kind of suspicious, since Susan Berman, who was about to be interviewed by the police surrounding Kathy's disappearance, was shot to death on December 23rd, execution style. Robert had a flight out that night to New York, and the day her body was discovered, police received a letter stating that a quote-unquote cadaver would be found at her address. Also to note here is that the address was misspelled as Beverly Hills, but it was spelled Beverley, which, if nobody out there knows, is not correct. So just remember that.
Now, we just want to add here that when detectives searched Susan's house after the murder, they did find some interesting things, which were on her computer. They found a list of names and how much money they had loaned her. They found out she was also months behind on rent.
She wrote a ton of articles and screenplays, but none of them were being bought. I did look at a list she had made on the computer, and Robert's name was on there, saying that he had given her $50,000, which was the most anyone had given her. Some people honestly believed that it was a mob hit, and some people believed that the $50,000 was Robert paying her off. Friends of Susan's even mentioned that it wouldn't surprise them if she had blackmailed Robert into giving her that money.
So during an interview, Roberts asked how he felt when he heard about Susan's death. Now, remember, this was his best friend of decades. So he says, quote, "I felt terrible for Susan. I was astonished that they were putting all this together, that I did it or I caused it to be done. I had nothing to do with Susan Berman's death," end quote.
At the same time, he also stated that he understands why she got killed. Quote, "Because she was my spokesman and all of a sudden she's dead right after Janine Pero's investigation of me, that I shut her up," end quote. Even though Robert was in LA at the time of Susan's funeral, he did not come. But he did have time to call Susan's friends and family asking what they knew about the investigation.
Robert was still living in Galveston when, on September 28th, 2001, he came to allegedly find his 71-year-old neighbor, Morris Black, in his apartment watching TV. Now, although the two men were friends, Robert claimed that Morris pointed a gun at him, and when Robert tried to get the gun from him, they struggled, and then Morris was shot to death in his face. So, this is where his true colors start to come out. He then dismembered the body, wrapped the pieces in garbage bags, tossed them in Galveston Bay, and then Morris's torso was later found floating in Galveston Bay.
An investigator who was on the scene when Morris was found said, quote, "I had to put my hand down the neck in order to pull it up from the water," end quote. They eventually found more body parts as they searched. Police stated that this was so gruesome and said that only some parts were cut in half and then ripped the rest of the way, like someone had stepped on them and pulled upwards to rip off the limbs. His head was unfortunately never recovered after many days and efforts of searching.
When police went to Morris Black's apartment to search it, they found drop cloths all over the kitchen, and when they lifted them up, there were shoe prints and knife cut marks all over the kitchen floor. They assumed this is where the murder had occurred.
They then started looking into his quote-unquote neighbor, the ugly deaf woman, Dorothy Siner, who the landlord said was very quiet, kept to herself, and traveled most of the time, so she was hardly ever there. This made the detective suspicious right away because he thought, how could this lady afford to travel so much but lives in this dump of an apartment? They went through all of Dorothy's trash and put it into evidence.
They found an appointment receipt from an eyeglasses store that hadn't been picked up yet. The name on the receipt was Robert Durst. The detective went to the eye clinic and told the clerk that if Robert came to pick up glasses to call them. In the meantime, they also found a price tag from the local hardware store. When they went to find out that Robert had purchased, they saw he got a 4-inch paring knife, drop clothes, and a bow saw. After seeing this, the detective gets a page that Robert just picked up the glasses.
He was arrested with the bow saw in the front seat, but Deborah bailed him out on a $250,000 bail, and then he fled to Pennsylvania after renting a car under the name Morris Black in Alabama.
After a 6-week manhunt, he was arrested for shoplifting Band-Aids, a chicken sandwich, and a newspaper at a supermarket. Meanwhile, there was like $38,000, 2 guns, and Morris Black's ID in his car. And just as an aside, evidently, a friend of mine that I've talked to actually had known of Robert Durst, and apparently he was caught pissing on a pack of Skittles. Like this guy, there was something wrong with this guy.
In 2003, Robert went on trial for Morris Black's murder, but was acquitted after claiming self-defense. You can even see him ask his lawyer, quote, "Did they say not? Are you sure?" End quote. He even made the front page of the New York Times with the article titled, quote, "New York City real estate heir is acquitted of murder in Texas. Durst, who cut up a body, argued self-defense." End quote. The Late Show even talked about it, and everyone laughed at how ridiculous it sounded.
However, he later pled guilty to several minor charges, including jumping bond, and he served about 6 months in prison in 2005. Even though he did admit to dismembering him and throwing Morris in the bay, after he was released less than 6 months later, he then violated his parole and spent another 26 days in jail. Sure, let's just let him out again. And by the way, that's sarcasm.
In 2006, Robert reportedly paid $65 million to settle a lawsuit he had filed in 1994 for his share of the family's wealth. He carried on with his real estate activity and sold 2 properties he had bought in 2011 for $8.65 million and sold them for $21.15 million in 2014. And when he was apprehended in 2015, his net worth, according to the FBI, was around $100 million.
In 2010, a movie, All Good Things, remember that was the name of his store that Kathy ran, but the movie depicted a fictionalized version of Robert Durst's life. After Robert saw the movie himself, he told someone in the film crew that he would like to be interviewed about his side in this story, and that is how a 6-part HBO series on him was born. And I just find this interesting because in the past 10 months or so that we've been doing this podcast, we always touch up on narcissism in one point or another. And just about every single killer, every single offender has just a touch of narcissism. And that right there was please interview me. That's pretty, in my opinion, kind of narcissist. But,
He agreed to be interviewed by Andrew Jarecki and Max Smerling, documentarians who were making this series about Robert. He met with them in 2010 and in 2012. During the 2012 meeting, Bobby walked into the bathroom after the interview, not realizing he was still mic'd up, and said while he was alone, quote, "What the hell did I do? Killed them all, of course." End quote. Sadly, the 2 filmmakers said that they did not even notice this footage until 2 years later.
That documentary was called The Jinx, The Life and Deaths of Robert Durst, and it premiered on HBO in February of 2015. If you haven't seen it, you should go watch it. It gives more information than we can fit into this podcast. And by the way, I had so much fun watching this with Amanda. We were both kind of looking at it just for the research purposes, but it's wild. But yeah, while watching it, just keep thinking to yourself that Robert put this documentary into motion and watched it while chilling, a free man.
In episode 4, he's in the room by himself and kept saying, quote, "I did not knowingly, purposefully, intentionally lie. I did not knowingly, purposefully, intentionally lie. I did not knowingly, purposefully, intentionally lie." He said this over and over again. I did make mistakes. That's what he also kept saying under his breath, like he was rehearsing it. You could see his lawyer run into the room and tell him that the mic picks up everything and they could hear everything he had just said. Robert then blew it off and said, quote, "I was reviewing. Oh, you could hear everything I said? I never intently, it's a question of not what I say, but how I say it. I never intentionally, purposefully lied. I made mistakes. I did not tell the whole truth. Nobody tells the whole truth." End quote. He was completely thrown off and started just spewing bullshit.
Everything that comes out of that man's mouth is just total bullshit. You also see in the Jinx that Susan's stepson, Sareb, found a letter from Robert to Susan in her things when she died. The Beverly Hills was misspelled. It was misspelled Beverley. And it was misspelled the same way as the letter sent to the police and then the exact same handwriting. We will attach a picture of that in our show notes. It's eerie. This broke Sareb. He knew Robert, trusted him. Robert even offered to pay for half of his college tuition after Susan died.
The film crew did not immediately tell the LAPD. They instead put this letter Sareb had found and a copy of the cadaver letter the police had received, and they put them in a secret security box at the bank. Then said they will ask Robert about the letters while interviewing him, get him on film talking about it, and then give all of that to the LAPD once they had something on him. Now, I want to point out that this is the 5th and last episode of the Jinx Robert saw before he was arrested.
The night before the 6th and last episode aired on March 15th, Robert was arrested for Berman's murder. He was arrested in a New Orleans hotel where he was staying under a false name. He was in possession of a gun, a fake ID, a latex, creepy, very realistic looking mask, and more than 40 grand at the time, which the gun alone is illegal since he's a felon. In 2016, he pled guilty to weapons charges and was sentenced to 85 months in prison in California. It's unknown how many years he was charged for pissing on a bag of Skittles. Again, sarcasm, but I digress.
2 years later, a judge ordered him to stand trial after determining that there was enough evidence against him for the murder of Susan Berman. He, of course, pled not guilty like the coward he was, and in March 2020, his trial began, though it was postponed for a while due to COVID. Robert himself had numerous medical issues and surgeries at this point, including esophageal cancer, getting a shunt put into his brain for hydrocephalus, and cervical spinal fusion.
Now, remember that list that Kathy's friends found? Well, this of course came up in the trial, and he explained on the stand that this was shorthand for tow dump. He was going to tell the high school kid who helped around the house to go to the town dump to drop off his sailboat. Bridge, or Bridgehampton, where he needed to visit. Dig meant digital. Shovel meant snow shovels. Check cars/truck meant check the gas. Yeah. And rent, he meant that he was going to have the high school kid rent a truck to go to the dump. The whole thing was pretty laughable. You had to be 25 to rent a car, and he wasn't a stupid man. It sounded like a jumbled mess coming from him.
Investigators also reportedly looked into Robert's involvement in the disappearance of 18-year-old Lynn Schultz from Vermont, 16-year-old Karen Mitchell from California, and 18-year-old Kristen Modafferi from San Francisco, but was never charged for them. In 2021, he was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. Shortly after, New York officials charged him with murdering his first wife, Kathleen Durst, who was declared legally dead in 2017.
So Robert Durst died in 2022, before the case was tried, which is unfortunate. Not that he's passed, but that closure hasn't been received. In total, he has a list of 3 confirmed victims, which is Susan Berman, Kathleen McCormick Durst, and Morris Black, and 3 suspected victims, Lynn Catherine Schultz, Kristen Deborah Modafferi, and Karen Marie Mitchell. And that is the case of Robert Durst.
God, I'm glad I'm done with that.
I bet. He was crazy.
Okay, thank you for that, because it leads into my ending quote.
Okay, go for it.
All right. He's not crazy. He's diabolical.
Is that from Dino Cazares? I think that's how you say his last name, from Fear Factory?
No idea who you're talking about.
Fear Factory is a heavy metal band. Well, new metal. Kind of like Robert Durst. He's kind of like that.
No, it's not Fred Durst.
So it's not Dino Cazares. It's not, oh man. Is it Halsey?
Ooh, very close, but no.
Okay, who is it?
It is actually a quote from an investigator in this case, Detective Cody Cazales.
I thought it was Dino because I was reading it like that. That was very impressive. Thank you. Don't forget that we have our Dallas True Crime Podcast Festival on August 26th through the 28th.
Yes, come see us.
Yes.
Also, we have a new Patreon. Woo-hoo. MJ, welcome.
MJ.
Also, don't forget that starting May 10th, we will have our biggest deep dive ever starting.
Yes.
I'm so excited for this one.
Dude, me too. Me too. You mess with the bees, you get the fucking hive. Just so you know.
Yes. All right. So we are proposing 3 episodes, but it very well could turn into 4.
It could turn into 20. Oh. I don't know. We don't know. We're that disorganized.
Oh.
Listen, I'm going to have fun with it, okay? But yes, it's going to be very compelling. So anyway, friendly reminder that just really quick, I just want to remind everyone that just because you feel isolated, you're not. And if you feel rejected, it's likely a problem with them, not you.
That's very perceptive and deep of you, Court.
Thank you.
Do we have any other important business?
Nope. I don't think so.
Are you sure? Anything happened over the past week or so that we need to make our listeners aware of?
You mean that you worked super hard on this case with all 8,000 words and 2 months of research?
No, silly. I mean, yeah, I busted my ass, but I guess we better not be talking about that. But anything else?
God, not that I can recall.
Are you sure? Because I really seem to recall something happened.
Nope. Can't think of anything that matters. So, with that, though, just don't be a dick.
No word deodorant.
Bye. Thank you for listening to A Nefarious Nightmare. Music used in this podcast was originally from Ghost Stories Incorporated, remixed and made for this podcast by Ryan RCX Murphy. Additional music is by Epidemic Sound. All research depending on the episode is done by Amanda Cronin and Courtney Fenner. Episode scripting, sound design, editing, and episode mastering and release are done by Courtney Fenner. Please leave us a 5-star rating and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you very much for listening, and take care.